I'm your host, Nick Cavalancia. I'm a conversational geek CEO. I'm also a Microsoft MVP. And I've got two great speakers with me today. Just want to introduce both of those first, and we're going to cover a little bit of housekeeping items, and then we'll jump into the webcast today. First, joining me today is Anthony Spiteri. He's a senior global technologist with Veeam. Anthony, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, hey Nick, how y'all going?
Everything's good here. Glad you're here. And I'm also joined by Vince Woody, Senior Systems Admin with OffsiteDataSync. Vince, thanks for joining as well.
How's it going, y'all?
Hey, glad you're here. Everything's good on this end. So a couple housekeeping items. Today's webcast is being recorded. So if you wanted to be looking out for an email a little later on this week, you'll see a link to the recording. You can come back and watch it later on if you'd like. We are taking questions throughout the webcast. I will have the Q&A box up and running the entire time. So if you do have questions, feel free to interject those throughout the webcast today. Also want to talk a little bit about the format. It's not a traditional webcast, the death by PowerPoint, where someone tries to cram in 78 slides in 20 minutes, that kind of thing. Instead, we have just a very few number of slides. This is more of a conversational format than anything, which is why I do want you to feel like you can interject into our webcast and ask questions, comments, thoughts, whatever comes to mind throughout, because we want you to participate. So if you don't see the slides advancing while we're talking a bit, that's okay. That just probably means really I want you to think about the slides as being visual indicators of what we're talking about, as opposed to thinking that the slides are continually going to be changing over and over and over again. So with all those kinds of things out of the way, let me talk a little bit about the agenda for today's webcast and some of the key takeaways. We're going to first talk a little bit about what's at risk, and just thinking about if you're trying to decide between, let's say, DRaas and backup, because we were trying to make the point here today that backup definitely isn't the same as DRaas. We're trying to figure out which technology, which methodology is best for your organization. We want you to base that on what's really important to the organization itself, to the business, and work backwards to the technology. We'll talk about comparing the two and looking at them. I have a real nice side-by-side grid you can have taken a screenshot of, and so on. And that way kind of really get a sense of what is the difference between the two and why would I bother thinking about one over the other. And then once you've made a choice, sort of theoretically during the webcast, as it were, the idea is how do you put a plan in place? How do I actually execute on that so that you know that you're actually protecting the environment, as opposed to just thinking I have backups or I'm ready to recover when I'm ready to recover, but you don't really have a plan. So we want to talk about putting those in place here. And so where I'm going to start here is just kind of with the first idea of level setting the problem. And the problem here is business continuity. Every one of your customers, your employees, your contractors, your supply chain, anyone else that works with you, they're all expecting your business to be up and running. So there's this expectation that exists today that you will always be on. I mean, think about it, even you yourself. You open up your phone, you go to, let's say, your bank app, you click on the bank app. There's never a question in your mind that the bank is going to be up or down. You're just assuming it's going to be up and that you'll be able to access those services. And so your organization, even your customer's organization, same thing is expected of them as well. And so there's a bit of a challenge here. And so a couple stats I want to put up here. This first one comes from Forrester. You see here almost 2/3 of organizations are thinking about the risk around business continuity is only getting greater. And one of the reasons why that risk is getting greater is because there's a greater expectation. And so now it really does matter. And so those small issues, those small risks are now kind of magnifying, because if anything impacts business continuity, that becomes an issue. And I've got a couple of examples of where issues can arise that are going to result with a problem around business continuity. And the first one is just the problem of ransomware. And you see this comes from Sophos, the state of ransomware report from last year. About 37% of orgs, so a little more than a third, are experiencing ransomware attacks. That means that they're not just having, let's say, a phishing attack that was thwarted by a user didn't click on it or the security solution blocked it. I mean, full all the way through and actually experiencing the attack where systems get encrypted. The threat actors have moved laterally throughout the organization, that kind of thing. So 37% of either your organization, or if you happen to be an MSP, your customers' organizations have experienced ransomware attacks. That's something that obviously can impact business continuity to a tune of weeks, months, even quarters in some cases. The complexity of businesses, where you have organizations that are doing M&A activity, either they're selling something off, so breaking a piece of the organization off, they're adding new organizations in. We saw a lot of that going on even during the height of the pandemic in 2020, lots and lots of M&A activity. You see almost half of organizations are expecting that to increase, and that comes from Bain's Global M&A report. And then the last one here is the idea of the reliance on third parties, and I wanted to kind of focus in on the idea around supply chains, where we now have this great reliance on different businesses. Even just think about the security solutions you have in place today as an example, or even the backup solutions you have in place today. You're relying on those solutions being secure. And so you can see with the Identity Theft Resource Center, there's been a 42% increase in supply chain attacks. That's the first half of this year versus the first half of last year. So all these is just a couple of examples of things that are really going to impact business continuity. And there's a lot more risk. You still have fat fingering, you still have natural disasters, those things all come into play, but there's a lot of growing concern around things that we have a lot less control over that are increasing on their own, like the idea of ransomware attacks, like business continuity, like reliance on third party. So Vince and Anthony, where I think I want to start the conversation is this idea of choosing a particular data protection model, this, backup or DRaas. Obviously, we've got this whole webcast themed. Backup is not DRaas. They're definitely different. So we have organizations in the audience that are trying to figure out how do they pick which one is right for them. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about a couple of things here. There's many ways that you can end up protecting the organization. You've got, for example, start with backups as the example. I myself go back 28 years in IT. If anybody goes that far back with me, my first server was a NetWare 2.2 server running on a 286 in non-dedicated mode. That's how old I am. Been doing this a long time. And we had backups back then even. And it was a Cheyenne, an ArcServe, and the really old ones that have been on forever, went to tape, that kind of thing. We've been doing that for decades. And then DRaas today is sort of the leading model. It's the thing that is more cutting edge. But we've got both of these ways as an example on either end of the spectrum. And there are ways that are in the middle, things like even doing just replication of VMs. You've got hyperconvergence. There's lots of other kinds of technologies that are helping with some form of data protection, but not exactly in the same way. And the idea here is to really start choosing the data protection model for your organization based off of the business requirements. I'm a really big believer in whether it's business continuity, or we're talking about cybersecurity, or kind of anything else that's going to really impact the organization. You start with what the business needs are, and then you work backwards to the technology that's going to help meet those needs. And so I've got a couple of examples here, just things like, what are operations business requirements? Well, how much do you have to be up and running? How much data can you lose? How long can you be down before it really impacts the reputation and the revenue of the organization? All those things have to come in play. The data itself that needs to be protected. How big is it? What kind of data is it? How easy is it to replicate that? Or do you have to back it up file by file? Or, it's those kinds of issues kind of come into play. And even just what are the availability needs, which kind of ties back to things like your recovery time and your recovery point objectives, helping define what does availability look like for your organization. Do you need something where you have to be up and running within minutes? Can you be hours? Can you be days? Can you be weeks? Can you be months? No one can be really months. I know that, but you get my point. And it also kind of depends on what part of operations. Not every part of operations is the same. And then you're also thinking about the risks. So the requirements are based off of those things of what the business is trying to attain, but then also the risks that kind of come into play. And you can see here, like the impact, should that happen? Should you have a lack of operations? What happens to, and you see the list here, reputation, money, legal, compliance, et cetera, and thinking about what is the impact going to look like, because that's going to help define the risk for you, as well as, is it going to impact the viability of the business? There is a stat, which I'm going to get wrong, so I don't have it in front of me. But it's something like, I want to say it was 27% of businesses that, let's, for example, that were affected by a ransomware attack had to shut down operations for some period of time. That was the way it was written. Could be hours, could be days, could be weeks. didn't specify, but some period of time. And so from that perspective, there is an impact on the viability of the business. So I've done enough talking. Vince, Anthony, I want to kind of pull you in on a bit of a conversation here a little bit. And Vince, I'm going to start with you. I've written a couple questions down here. I can start with this really kind of simple one here. Up at the very top of my slide, I start talking about how backups are on one end of the spectrum. It's been around for a long time. And DRaas is sort of cutting edge. And why do you believe that backups is still sort of remains a choice for organizations today?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So the main opinion I have here is that having the right tool for the job is key. If your business requirements take into consideration geolocation, regulations, lack of connectivity, operating decisions that may or may not be what you choose, then maybe DRaas is not an option for you. Maybe replications are not an option for you. I.e., you have a site in Alaska somewhere and there's no cellular connectivity there. There's nothing. You don't have a choice. Okay, then backups may be the right choice for you. But just take those business requirements into consideration and think big picture. Don't just think about, okay, the stuff's running, I need to protect it now. Think, okay, it's running now, I've got backups. If fat finger or oops happens, I'm protected. But what happens if blank happens? And then after the fact, think big picture.
I love that thinking. Anthony, with Veeam having, I mean, you've got a number of solutions that you're offering that kind of go everything from sort of basic backup. I mean, that's obviously there's a lot more than that, all the way up to DRaas and orchestration and automation and that kind of everything kind of in between. Are you seeing customers evolving their thinking away from backups to in favor of DRaas?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, what it really comes down to, though, is that, we haven't quite reached what I call the inflection point where people understand, or customers and businesses understand, that they need to go to DR as a service as opposed to backup. Backup is becoming table stakes, and not to underplay it at all, but certainly people understand that they need backup. We're there. We've been through it, but that's taken a long time. You mentioned 28 years in the industry. Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking in my head, I think I've just touched on 20, or going to touch on 20. But backup was kind of important when I started, but it was still that thing we did on the side. So it was seen to be more or less something that you have to pay for because you just kind of do, an insurance policy. And no one likes to pay for insurance, right? But that's kind of been solidified. People understand they need backup. DR as a service hasn't quite tipped over that point yet where people think that they need it. So it's more of that, we'll use it if we have an incident, and then let's look at, what we need to do to mitigate that incident moving forward. That said, when you talk about the complexity of what's happening with ransomware, you touched on that, supply chain attacks, scary. People are now understanding that they need to look at their business, look at their workloads, categorize their workloads, split them up into certain tiers, and understand that not all workloads should be backed up holistically. You might need to look at the top 3 to 5% of your workloads and see if they are the ones that you can do DR for. So do you do high-end replication, CDP, or do you do just normal snapshot-based replication? You mentioned, RPOs and RTOs, it's all critical. So there's a huge element of risk involved in just thinking that backup is going to be okay for your business. But I think, like you've got down on your PowerPoint there, you got to really think about, what are the risks? What is at risk if I have a problem with some part of my platform, some part of my applications, and how am I going to bring that back? That's the big thing. So I think backup is a known quantity at the moment. DR is becoming a much more established way of doing things.
I like, in both the questions I asked each of you, you both have touched on sort of something that I already said, which is the sort of thinking about the business and working backwards to the technology. And you each said it in your own way. I'm wondering today, just so our audience can be kind of getting maybe a gauge here. And this is to both of you. So either one of you could take this first, but what are you seeing prospective customers actually base their data protection method on? Are they doing the right thing? The stuff that we've been talking about, you should base it off the business needs and what's practical and what's possible, or are they just simply utilizing, a technology because they've always used it, or what are you seeing?
So I'll jump in. The customers that I work with most often are focusing on, not only are their backups viable and usable in a DR scenario, but they're also thinking about, what are they missing? And what I mean by that is not from a service offering, but what are they missing in their big picture? In the case of a disaster, if they call up ODS and our OffsiteDataSync and say, I need my stuff now, go, and they declare a disaster, what is not in those backups? Is there a third party that they need to communicate with? Is there some other application they forgot to put in there, and they, through testing, found, oh, okay, yeah, I forgot that other VM or that this, whatever it may be. So again, it goes back to thinking big picture, but your backups are a start. Then what's missing to get to the business requirements or whatever you need to be protected in the case of a disaster? Anthony?
Yeah, I think that really rolls off what I was about to talk about, which was, we offer our providers, our service providers, of which ODS is one of our great ones around the world. We give them the tooling to be able to create services that cater to their customers, right? So, Veeam's got a number of different platforms covering a number of different workloads, no matter where they are, hypervisors in the cloud. We offer a number of different tool sets to be able to get customers to get their data from an on-premises location into providers like ODS. So I think the point there is that we will always be able to provide great technology companies like ODS the ability to cater to what their customers want. So that's one of the big things about us as a backup provider, is allowing the technology to be utilized by guys like ODS.
And I'm actually honing on something you said, Anthony, which is what their customers want. And tying that back to some things Vince mentioned, for you in the audience, I think it really is you guys deciding what it is you truly need, what it is you want, meaning what you need in order to accomplish your business objectives. Backup should not be to, I think Anthony had mentioned it being a insurance policy and no one wants to pay insurance. This should be something where you're really thinking about it from a perspective of, we're using backups as a way of continuing business operations, not as an insurance policy. And therefore, how do we want to continue our business operations? What should that look like? So let's jump on to the next slide I've got here, which is about comparing backup and DRaas. I'm just going to double check. No questions so far in the queue, but that's okay. But if you do have questions, comments, thoughts, stick those in the Q&A box. I'm going to continually keep checking that. And what I've decided to do is to put up a table. And this isn't an exhaustive table by any means, but it's just a couple of different areas. If you want to grab a screenshot of this, you can. And I'm comparing backups to DRaas a little bit from a number of different perspectives. And I sort of tried to work this from a standpoint of sort of chronologically speaking. Like initially, you have to go buy something or engage a partner with a service. So there's sort of a cost model. And there's some things around backups and around the data protection. And then there's a little bit about the recovery. So that I'm kind of walk this chronologically. And I want to focus in on just a couple of areas. The first one is the recovery focus between the two. In the case of backup, it's traditionally you're just trying to restore whatever it is that's unavailable. It's sort of a very simplistic way of thinking about, I backed up server 5, I'm recovering server 5. Yes, it can be more than a server. It could be the entire environment, but you're just really thinking about, I'm trying to restore that which I backed up. Versus over on DRaas, you're really thinking about it from an operational availability standpoint. You're really thinking about, how do I get this operation back up and running? And it takes usually into consideration things like the different types of disaster scenarios, dependencies between applications, any kind of updates that need to be made. I mean, the things, who's going to do the work, all of that testing, planning. I'm going to talk about some of that as well in this slide here, but there's more to it than just, I want to recover that which was backed up. The other one here is thinking about the recovery objectives. And I call them RXOs. That's sort of my own little way of saying RTOs. That's the recovery time objective, the amount of time that you want to be recovered within. And then recovery point objectives, which means basically back to what point are you going to recover? Or another way of looking at it is, how much data am I willing to lose? And a lot of cases, those are measured in minutes. Now, typically, you can see in backups, it's usually measured in hours or days, because you're doing backups in either every 4 hours, once a day, those kinds of things. Versus DRaas is typically looking at particular workloads and figuring out, how do we back this up very, very quickly so that we can literally get down to minutes. But I put seconds, and I don't mean necessarily 1, 2, 3 seconds, but I mean sub 1 minute. So you're measured in seconds, but it's not necessarily like, boom, you're up and running again. It doesn't always work exactly that way, but it can be that quick depending on the workload. And then there's another one here about the recovery target. With backups, traditionally, you're trying to recover to either a secondary data center that you have or the same exact location that went down. Versus DRaas, it's provided as a service. So everything, including the infrastructure, typically, the recovery infrastructure that is, typically is included. And so you're really thinking about recovering to a secondary cloud-based infrastructure that is completely offsite. And so that way you're getting another layer of protection, because you're not worried about whether or not your particular location is down or not, because it doesn't matter in the case of DRaas. Then there's this process issue here. Recovery is typically kind of a manual process with backups. So you're picking the backup job that needs to be recovered and you're recovering it. Versus with DRaas, there's an opportunity to use orchestration. You can do both for failover and for failback. So meaning failover, let's fail over the entire environment if that need be to a secondary cloud infrastructure. And then once the disaster has been alleviated and remediated, we can fail everything back to the normal production environment on premises, if that's the case, or to your own data center or whatever. And then the last one here I want to bring up here is the idea of who's doing the work. And you'll see both with backups and with recovery. In the case of backup, it's traditionally your own internal IT staff that's doing it. But in the case of a disaster, let's say even like ransomware, what happens if, let's say, half of your workstations get encrypted along with all your servers? It would be really nice to divide and conquer there, I think. And having some help from a DRaas service provider doing that for you, doing, let's say, at least the critical workloads, getting the operations back up and running. Maybe you all can focus on either re-imaging or recovering workstations, or some kind of division of labor would be really helpful. And you'll see with DRaas, you've got a service provider always helping you. And it should be noted that in the case of DRaas, it doesn't mean that it depends on the provider. And maybe we'll talk about this a little bit, Vince, in a second here, but it's not always we're just the DRaas providers doing all of the work. They might be doing some of the work as much as you want them to do. Could be everything up to and including white glove service, but it also can be just, we need some assistance with, and then they're helping with certain parts. It depends on what the provider does. So Vince, I actually have a question for you that I wrote down for here first. I see this real disparity that exists between these two, especially when you look down all the rest of the rows that I didn't cover as well. And that's in sort of in the form of how this works, the function, its purpose, ultimately, even how it executes. And so my question for you is sort of, what are the biggest differences that your customers see with DRaas that benefits them directly?
Yeah, so whether it's backups or replication, they're all just files in another location at the end of the day. They do nothing for you if you don't have a partner to rely on to help you make use of them. As a result of being a resident of the U.S. Gulf Coast, I know firsthand that disasters I'm used to, a hurricane, for example, I may not have power for days.
Mm-hmm.
So files don't do me any good if I can't access them. That being said, a backup is acceptable when the recovery can wait until the disaster is over. DRaas is helpful while the disaster is happening, because, for example, as a customer of ODS, if you can make a phone call or send an email from your mobile phone, you can initiate the recovery. And as you said, DRaas, we become your partner in that. We become able to help you make use of whichever option you choose to use.
Love that. Now, Vince, when you're talking to prospective customers about DRaas, what's the one aspect that about DRaas that you are sort of continually mentioning as being sort of what makes it stand out?
Well, first off, when you're not needing it for a disaster, it becomes your test bed. At ODS, we offer DR testing. We can spin up your backups or your replications or whatever, and you can run through application upgrades or testing of a disaster scenario, what have you. So it's useful not just in a disaster scenario, it's useful when you're not in a disaster scenario.
Anthony, same question. What do you do? So when you talk to your customers, what are you saying that really makes DRaas stand out?
Yeah, I think, Vince hit the nail on the head there. It's how do you make that data or what's at the other end work for you more? And I think you can get a lot more out of it than just traditional DRaas. And that's a very good point. So I just wanted to highlight that again. But I think it's just the whole key behind the fact that, traditionally speaking, you would have had to set up a secondary data center, put all your equipment in there, deal with the costs of that, holistically. Whereas when you're talking about a cloud provider, typically what they do is they have some sort of cost model, which is beneficial to the customer, okay, which means that you don't need to go and fork out everything to have a like for like at the cloud end or the DR as a service end, and only really spin it up when you need to. So that's a big component of it. But again, the testing is huge because that just allows you to not only make sure that you can, bring something up or bring a system up if you've got a hurricane coming down on you. I love the fact that you guys, live on that coast because it creates some great stories for us as well. And we've certainly heard some use in anger. So, where I am here in Australia, we don't have a lot of that. So we can't really put those great stories to play, right? So it's good to be able to, have that software working in anger for us through guys like ODS. But yeah, I think really that cost optimization is the great number one thing that I say. It's really just a way to reduce your capital expenditure, but still get the desired outcome, which is business continuity.
Excellent there. So, and then Vince, back to you. Let's talk a little bit. I mentioned this earlier. Talk a little bit about the who is doing each of these, and I kind of have it still highlighted here. Would you paint a picture for the audience of how you can use ODS as a service provider, or just talk about it generically? Either or is fine, but how the service provider would sort of interact and integrate with an internal IT team so that in order to accomplish all of this?
Yeah, sure. So initially, the who in this picture is going to be both the internal IT team and the DRaas partner. The difference with DRaas is when you actually move into that level of service, because as I mentioned earlier, the DRaas provider becomes your partner in the case. So you don't have to do it all yourself, as you mentioned. With regards to how, provided that the solution's been tested and that a DR, or disaster recovery or business continuity plan has been created, it's time to put that plan to work. That means delegation of duties, that means open communication, but ultimately it's time to bring the DRaas solution online. And this is going to look different from one customer to another because of size, scale, implementation, needs, blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm. No, that's perfect. I'd agree there as well. And so, depending on those of you in the audience, what your skill sets are, what you're capable of doing, what your previous experience are, that sort of thing, those also kind of come into play to determine how much you want to rely on the partner and how much you don't need to rely on the partner. In some cases, there are organizations that simply utilize a DRaas provider and a service provider as being there in case we can't do it ourselves, or the scenario doesn't allow us to do it ourselves. And in other cases, it's we have no idea what we're doing. We just want you to do it. So you set it all up for us and we're good. So let's talk a little bit about building a plan. Whether you in the organization are you going to go stick with the backup as the methodology, you're going to go the DRaas route. There's still an opportunity, regardless of where you kind of sit on that spectrum, to do the same kinds of steps to build a plan that's going to protect your organization. I think that's the important thing here. Just having backups, whether the intent is done under the idea of just using backups and recovering, or if it's actually part of disaster recovery, just performing the backups and having them lying in wait, a good start, but that's not enough. And so the first thing is leverage an expert partner that's done this before. If you've never worked yourself through a ransomware recovery scenario, you probably should talk to somebody that has, because it's very likely you're going to at some point. So I would start there. Second thing is performing a business impact analysis. If you haven't done that, that is the process of going through and identifying which parts of the business operations would, if they were down, would most impact the organization. It's a very simple way of looking at it, but it's kind of like what can't be down, or what can be down for a short period of time? How long can it be down for? If it is down, that kind of thing, you're kind of determining what the impact would be on the business. So you identify, oh, these 4 workloads are absolutely critical, can't be without those, but these other 7, we can wait like a week and we'd be fine. that kind of thing. Like, the marketing data, we can get that up in a week later. We don't care. But getting the CRM system that we have on premises up and running so sales can operate and keep sales going, that's critical, that kind of thing. And then you do a risk assessment where you look and see what is the actual risk of having, let's say, a ransomware attack or a natural disaster or a fire or whatever the case is. And you actually align the two, where you go, all right, so I see how likely it is we might have a ransomware attack, and what would happen if that and how would that impact, if those workloads we determined in the business impact analysis were affected. And so you're putting those two together and you figure out what your technology is that exists today can provide in those scenarios. So ransomware with the CRM, but ransomware with the marketing data, and you go, what can we do today with what we have? And you determine what your technology gaps are. So we really did start with the business and work backwards at technology. And now we move forward saying, we got to figure out what else we might need. You address those gaps, and then you start building a recovery plan. In a lot of cases, it's per scenario. It's per type of disaster, if you will. And in the world of cybersecurity, you would have things like a data breach versus ransomware attacks. Those kinds of threat actions are starting to kind of concentrate in a very specific set that look alike no matter what. So that's kind of good from a business continuity standpoint. You don't have to figure out a certain number of systems are going to be impacted, that kind of thing, in terms of maybe somebody moving laterally or making modifications of the system from a security standpoint. But then certainly with ransomware, you have this extra added, everything's encrypted kind of aspect. But you build a recovery plan, but more importantly, and Vince mentioned this early on, you're going to test it. Most organizations will do tabletop testing, but there's a real need to do some actual simulation testing where you're doing the work. You're going through that process. And you heard even Vince mention, even if you're trying to do try out an upgrade of something, you still do a recovery of a system in another environment. You try out the upgrade, but you're doing that. You're testing all that out to see how it's going to work. So Vince, let me ask you a question first that kind of ties back to what we talked about in the last slide, but of all this stuff here that's listed, how much of this would be the service provider in a DRaas scenario, or if they're leveraging an expert partner even for backups, and how much of this is the internal IT team?
Well, I'm going to answer this in a little bit of a long-winded way, but having been through part of this discussion as a customer and prior to joining OffsiteDataSync, I can say that it's about 50-50. And what I mean by that is this list is not a one and done type task list. You need to work through it, rinse and repeat as you work through the different types of disasters, because as you said, cybersecurity is going to need a different approach as compared to, power outage, as compared to flood, frogs, fire, what have you. So again, go through it multiple passes. Each time you go through it, the person performing one aspect of this list may be different. For example, what's the risk assessment or gaps? You're going to take it from your infrastructure, wherever that lives. But I may look at it and say, okay, you've got all of those risks assessed, but from a DR as a solution, DR as a service side, you're Mr. Bob, you're the only one that can get into this. So what happens if you're unavailable? So you need to delegate to someone else.
That's a really good point there. And that's sort of why it probably needs to be a mix of both. And that's something that I sort of hinted at was those in the audience, you're figuring out whether you want white glove or you want to do it all yourself. And obviously with a plan, though, to your point, Vince, if you've truly built a proper plan, then you're planning for that in case that particular person is not there. You have an entire team laid out, multiple people have access to the credentials necessary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then that gets taken care of. Anthony, I mentioned orchestration on the previous slide on the DRaas side, which obviously can impact testing and actual execution of recovery and disaster recovery during a real disaster scenario. So how impactful have you seen that be for customers in the recovery process?
It's huge, right? Because I think traditionally replication and backup are the easy part. Getting a copy of your data up to a cloud provider, is the easy part, right? Veeam gives the technology and it's basically leveraged and it's done, right? We offer the connectivity, the technology, get it up there, but certainly the orchestration part about what happens afterwards when you spin something up in case of a disaster, that's always been the extension that I think people don't think about too often, but it's obviously the hardest one. thinking about networking, thinking about, just even people really. But I think the biggest thing that we have today versus say when I was on the other side of the fence, even now 5 years ago, coming up 5 years, is that we didn't really have these orchestration tool sets that we have today. Infrastructure as code, general API, I think the ability for our providers to leverage the tooling better from our perspective. So as a vendor, we produce and we give our providers the ability to tap into our APIs, into our PowerShell, into our automation. They can then use the automation tooling of choice to basically then build that into their own product offerings. That said as well, what I'm seeing is an extension of that now with providers being able to take that a step further and actually letting their customers, orchestrate their own platforms. So they're not orchestrating us per se, the vendor that's sitting underneath the surface. They're orchestrating the provider's platform as well. So I think we'll get to that stage. But certainly say when you do a failover now, you've got the tooling to be able to go, okay, I know that I'm going to bring up my disaster recovery site at ODS. I've got to think about networking. I've got to think about DNS. I think I can automate that now with the help of someone or self-sufficiently, but I've got more to be able to do that today versus 2 or 3 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, I'd add to that, orchestration adds a level of predictability. Because we know, for example, if you were going to recover the entire environment, you already know that Active Directory is going to be put up, or DNS is put up for Active Directory, which is going to be put up before an application that requires Active Directory, which is that kind of thing as well. Just something as simple as order. I mean, there's a lot more to it than just order, but even something as simple as order, it creates that level of predictability where you're like, why isn't this running? And it's not running because they're still recovering the Active Directory servers, which host the DNS, if that was the case when there's no orchestration. And that makes things kind of, a lot more simple. Let me pose a question to both of you. Again, a non-exhaustive list, on the slide here. What would you add to this list? Vince, can I put you on the spot? Start with you. What would you add to this list? Or if nothing else, maybe if the list is fine, what would you emphasize on the list?
Well, I don't know if you'd call it an ad or an emphasis, but
Sure.
After you've gone through and you've tested your plan, what I think is crucial is contacting any and all third parties that are involved in your environment. I mentioned it before, but from my own experience, I can't tell you how important this is. Make sure that if, for example, your third party that you work with requires all traffic to come from your public IP, i.e. they've got you whitelisted, it'll only allow requests from your IP. If that IP is not going to be available, it doesn't matter that I can restore your server for you because the traffic's going to be coming from the wrong place. So if you need to have a whitelist for a specific IP, then maybe you need either an additional VPN from somewhere else that you can connect through to get that data transfer, or if you require some specific hardware to be able to communicate. I know, for example, there are people that do printing or manufacturing of some kind, and they have specific hardware that has to connect through a server to a licensing place. If that hardware is not available, it doesn't matter that I can bring your server up. If the way that you do business is relying on a particular piece of hardware, you need to make sure you have that available too. So test, rinse, repeat, test again, work through it, find everything that is not in your backups or your replications, and make sure you have a solution for those when that disaster happens.
Wonderful. Anthony?
Yeah, and maybe emphasis on the, understanding your workloads, understanding the business and what it actually relies on, because I think I mentioned criticality of those workloads, being able to set certain tiers, so tier 1, 2, 3, and then attaching specific RTOs and RPOs to that, right? That to me is the first step. It needs to be done. And, what we try to say, what I preach at the moment when I'm talking to customers and partners and whatnot, is that that's really important because, again, with that, you can then apply a certain type of backup or a certain type of replication, DR as a service, whatever it might be, long-term retention to those workloads, and not only make yourself aware of what can be restored to start with, but I think it also helps with a lot of the economics of it as well. Understanding that the more expensive one is potentially going to be that critical tier 1 workload that you need to bring back really quickly. So you might need to pay a little bit more to actually protect that. But that one that's sitting in the back, the file server that's got the 7-10-year-old data on it, you can afford to bring that back over the past week or over the next week or whatever it is, right? So I think it's important because you understand exactly what needs to bring up to make your business run and still function. But then also, you know, just understand the cost pressures of what it actually is to run a DR recovery.
Wonderful. I appreciate the input from both of you. So, Vince, I know that there's a slide here to cover a little bit about ODS. And before you do that, I just want to make sure the audience, again, if you guys have questions, but anything we've talked about today, I've got two great experts here. I'd be happy to discuss, even if you want to talk about what you're doing today in backups, or what you're thinking about doing with DRaas, or maybe what you're doing today in DRaas. We have a nice opportunity in just a moment here to take some questions. There are currently none, which is absolutely fine, but in case you have a question, be sure to type that in the Q&A box. So with that, Vince, I'm going to hand the floor over to you to kind of cover your slide a little bit about OffsiteDataSync.
Sure. Yeah. So Veeam's Veeam OffsiteDataSync has been a Veeam service provider for a number of years, and we've been partner of the year multiple times. And the reason for that is that we have multiple teams that help you throughout multiple parts of your journey to being protected. Customer support, sales, the whole 9 yards. One thing that I really want to point out on this slide is the compliant section. Our data centers are in locations, tier 5, I think they call it. They're secure, way more secure than I'm really thinking they need to be. But if you have a requirement as a business that your data needs to meet certain compliances, it's possible with ODS. We have certified engineers on the team, and one thing that I focus on every day, it's my main job here, is DR testing. So, you know, we mentioned it multiple times throughout this presentation, but test often, and rinse and repeat.
Wonderful. So I'm looking here to see if there's any questions. I didn't see any coming in here. So I'm going to put this up here. If you do have something that comes in a moment, I'd be happy to answer that question for you. But in lieu of that, no issues letting class out. Looks like about maybe 15 minutes early. Nothing wrong with that as well. Vince, Anthony, thanks for a really good conversation. I mean, obviously we covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time. But I think hopefully this was very helpful to the audience to kind of get the differences between backup and DRaas, to understand why one is not the other. So thank you both for joining me today.
No worries.
No problem.
Yeah, glad you're here. And those in the audience, again, it seems like there's no questions, so we'll let class out early. Really appreciate your attention here. And so if you have any questions, you can see here a way to get a hold of OffsiteDataSync, both via phone number as well as via email as well. And we appreciate your attention today. And so that's going to conclude today's webcast. So thanks for joining us. We'll catch you on the next one.